In 2024, a Chinese smartphone brand most people in the West cannot even pronounce correctly shipped more phones than Samsung in Southeast Asia. Not by a narrow margin, not in one lucky quarter. Consistently, quarter after quarter, in markets that Samsung had dominated for nearly a decade. And almost nobody in the West noticed when it happened. But here's the part that makes this story so much bigger than a regional sales chart. This brand did not win by undercutting everyone on price. They did not win by flooding the market with cheap hardware. They won because they figured out something that Apple, Samsung, and every other major player had missed entirely. What the next billion smartphone buyers actually want. And they built the exact product that delivers it, at the exact price those buyers can afford, through the exact channels those buyers trust. If that sounds simple, good. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how they did it and why it threatens Apple's global growth story in a way that nothing else has come close to doing. Hit like and subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. Now, to really understand why this matters, we need to go back to a moment almost everyone has forgotten. The moment the smartphone world decided this brand was a permanent afterthought. The company everyone wrote off. Go back to 2016 and ask any analyst in London or New York which Chinese smartphone company would eventually challenge Apple at a global scale. You would have heard the same 2 or 3 names every single time. Huawei, because of their engineering. Xiaomi, because of their price disruption. Maybe OnePlus, because of the buzz they had built in enthusiast communities. Nobody said Oppo, and the reasons made sense on paper. Oppo was known primarily for one thing: making phones with very good cameras and selling them through offline retail stores in China, India, and Southeast Asia. They were not doing anything that looked like a technology leap. No custom chips, no grand software platform, no aggressive global expansion narrative, just phones, sold through shops, in markets that the global tech press rarely bothered to visit. The dominant assumption in the industry was that the offline retail model was a dead end. The future was online, direct-to-consumer, cutting out the middleman. Companies like Xiaomi had built their entire identity around that idea, and it worked brilliantly for a while. The conventional wisdom was that any brand still leaning heavily on physical stores was building on sand. That conventional wisdom was completely wrong, and the data proving it wrong has been sitting in quarterly reports for 3 years now. Most people just have not been paying attention. The number that changes everything. In the third quarter of 2024, Oppo ranked as the number 1 or number 2 smartphone brand by shipments in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. Combined, those 6 countries represent over 600 million people and some of the fastest growing middle classes on Earth. These are not small markets with a few million phone buyers. These are enormous consumer economies where hundreds of millions of people are buying their second or third smartphone, and for the first time, they have real money to spend on it. And in every single one of those markets, Oppo was beating Apple, not in total shipments. Apple's average selling prices put them in a completely different volume bracket, but in the segment that actually matters for Apple's future, the premium mid-range, the phones that cost between $300 and $600. The exact price band where Apple has been trying to grow for years through older iPhone models and where Oppo has been absolutely dominant. That number tells a very specific story. And the story is not about Oppo getting lucky in a few markets. It is about a decade of patient strategy that the Western tech press missed entirely because it was happening in places that do not generate trending content on LinkedIn. The camera that rewired expectations. To understand how Oppo pulled this off, you need to understand one decision they made back in 2013 that most people have never heard of. Oppo decided that the single most important feature for a smartphone buyer in an emerging market was not processing speed, not software fluency, not brand prestige. It was the camera. Specifically, the front-facing camera, the selfie camera, at a time when every other major manufacturer was focused on the rear camera experience. Oppo looked at how people in Southeast Asia and South Asia were actually using their phones, and they saw something the data made obvious, but that nobody else seemed to be acting on. People were taking selfies constantly, at family gatherings, at religious events, at celebrations that happened every few weeks across cultures with rich social traditions. And the front cameras on every phone in the market at that time were genuinely terrible. Grainy, poorly lit, unflattering. Oppo fixed it, not with the most advanced sensor in the world, with software processing built specifically for the skin tones, the lighting conditions, and the social context of the buyers they were targeting. The feature worked. The word of mouth worked faster. And suddenly Oppo had something no marketing budget can easily replicate. Real people recommending the phone to real people in real conversations because it made them look good in the photos they were sharing every day. That was the wedge. A camera feature that felt personal. That solved a real problem for real people. That spread through social networks before social networks were even the main marketing channel. But the camera was only the beginning. The distribution machine nobody talks about. While every analyst was celebrating the death of offline retail, Oppo was building one of the most sophisticated offline distribution networks the consumer electronics industry had ever seen in the developing world. In India alone, Oppo built relationships with over 100,000 retail stores by the early 2020s. Not big box electronics chains. Small shops, neighborhood stores in cities of 200,000 people where a local retailer's recommendation carries enormous weight because the buyer trusts them personally. The kind of stores where someone walks in not knowing exactly what they want and walks out with what the person behind the counter told them was the best option for their budget. Oppo trained those retailers. They gave them demonstration units. They built incentive structures that made recommending an Oppo phone financially worthwhile. They understood something fundamental about how purchasing decisions actually happen in these markets. The recommendation of a trusted local retailer in a second-tier Indian or Indonesian city is worth more than any digital ad campaign. It is word of mouth with a commercial engine underneath it. And they built that engine over a decade, quietly, without any of the fanfare that tech companies normally generate when they do something worth noticing. Apple cannot replicate this in 2 years or 5 years. The relationships are personal. The trust is earned over thousands of individual interactions. You cannot automate it or buy it with a marketing budget. You build it by showing up consistently in places that most global tech executives have never personally visited. The operating system play that Apple did not see coming. Now here's where the story gets significantly more complicated for Apple and significantly more interesting for everyone paying attention. Oppo does not just make phones. Through its parent company BBK Electronics, Oppo is part of a group that also includes Vivo and Realme, 3 separate brands, each targeting slightly different market segments, all sharing underlying technology infrastructure and supply chain relationships. That structure alone gives a group a scale advantage that is genuinely difficult to compete against on a cost basis. But the move that has the most long-term consequence is something Oppo has been building that almost nobody in the Western press has covered properly. ColorOS, Oppo's Android-based operating system. By the end of 2024, ColorOS had over 600 million monthly active users globally. To put that in perspective, that is more monthly active users than Twitter at its peak, more than Snapchat, more than almost any standalone platform most Western tech journalists would consider significant. And Oppo has been systematically building ColorOS into something that functions less like a skin on top of Android and more like an independent ecosystem platform. Custom AI features built specifically for languages and use cases that Google's own AI tools handle poorly or not at all. Localized app integrations that work better in specific markets than anything Google offers by default. Payment integrations. Health features tuned to local insurance and healthcare systems. Privacy settings calibrated to the actual legal and social context of the users rather than defaulted to whatever serves the advertising model best. This is not a distraction. This is a moat being built in plain sight. Every user who organizes their digital life around ColorOS features is a user who has a real switching cost attached to moving to a different phone. That switching cost is exactly what Apple has used for years to keep iPhone users inside the Apple ecosystem. Oppo is engineering a version of the same dynamic for 1 billion users Apple has never been able to fully reach. What Apple is actually losing. Let us be precise about what this means for Apple, because it is easy to misread the threat. Oppo is not competing with the iPhone 16 Pro Max. Nobody buying a $1,200 iPhone in Singapore is switching to an Oppo Reno because Oppo's camera is slightly better in certain lighting conditions. That is not the battleground. The battleground is the aspirational buyer, the person in Jakarta or Dhaka or Ho Chi Minh City who earns a monthly income that makes a $400 phone a significant purchase and a $1,000 phone a fantasy they are not close to. For that buyer, the choice is not iPhone versus Oppo. The choice is the best phone they can actually afford. And in that conversation, Oppo has spent a decade making themselves the obvious answer. The consequence for Apple shows up in a more subtle way. Every buyer who enters the smartphone market through Oppo and builds years of habit around ColorOS is a buyer who becomes progressively less likely to ever switch to iOS. The ecosystem switching cost accumulates. The familiarity deepens. By the time that buyer's income grows enough that an iPhone is theoretically within reach, they have spent 5 years inside a different digital environment. Their photos are stored differently. Their payments work differently. Their apps are different. The friction of switching is enormous. Apple's growth strategy in emerging markets has always been built on the assumption that aspirational buyers would eventually trade up into the Apple ecosystem. That assumption made sense when the alternatives were genuinely inferior. It makes significantly less sense when the alternative has had a decade to build ecosystem depth specifically designed to intercept exactly that trade-up moment and keep it from happening. In early 2025, Apple launched aggressive pricing promotions in India and several Southeast Asian markets. The discounts were real, and they moved units at the margins. They did not change the structural dynamic, because this is not a price problem Apple is facing. It is a timing problem. The habits were already formed. The ecosystems were already built. The trust was already established. The R&D bet that changes the next decade. There is one more chapter to this story that is not fully played out yet, and it is the one that matters most for the decade ahead. Oppo has been investing in chip design, not at the scale of Apple's silicon program. Not yet, but the direction is unmistakable and the intent is explicit. Oppo's chip subsidiary Mari Silicon has already produced custom imaging processors that handle computational photography in a way that general-purpose mobile chips cannot match at the same efficiency level. These are not full system-on-chip designs. They are specialized coprocessors, but they represent the beginning of a hardware-independent strategy that looks very familiar if you watch what Apple did between 2010 and 2020. Apple did not build silicon dominance overnight. They started with small customizations, then deeper integrations, then full system chips that allowed them to control the entire hardware and software experience in ways that no Android manufacturer could match, because they were all dependent on Qualcomm's roadmap. Oppo is starting that same journey, from a much lower base, with a much larger target market, to support the investment, and with a government that considers semiconductor independence a national strategic priority and funds it accordingly. The end point of that journey, if they reach it, is a phone where every layer from the chip to the camera processing to the operating system is designed and built entirely within the Oppo ecosystem, not dependent on Qualcomm, not dependent on Google in any meaningful sense, not dependent on any American company at any critical layer. That end point is still years away, maybe a decade, maybe more, but the direction is set and the investment is real, the game that was already won. Here's the thing about the story that most people miss when they look at the current market share charts. The competition for the next billion smartphone buyers is not happening now. It happened over the last 10 years in shops and cities that most global tech executives have never visited, through relationships built by salespeople earning commissions on individual handsets, through camera software tuned for specific skin tones and lighting conditions, through operating system features designed for the actual daily needs of people whose lives look nothing like the lives of the engineers in Cupertino who design iPhones. Oppo won that competition quietly, methodically, and almost completely without anyone in the Western tech press paying attention, until the sales numbers became impossible to ignore. Apple responded with discounts. Discounts help at the margins. They do not rebuild a decade of trust and familiarity that someone else already established. The Reno 13 series is not the most technically advanced smartphone on Earth, Apple's chip engineering still sets the benchmark at the absolute frontier. But the Reno 13 is proof of concept in the most literal sense. Proof that you can build a phone that wins in the markets where the next billion buyers actually live, without chasing Apple's specifications, without matching Apple's marketing budget, and without ever trying to fight Apple on Apple's terms. The rules of the game did not change overnight. Someone spent 10 years building a different game entirely, played it in places no one was watching, and by the time everyone looked up, the score was already settled. And it is showing up in Apple's quarterly earnings calls, in the language about headwinds in emerging markets, in the careful phrasing that analysts use when they do not want to say directly that Apple has a structural problem in the fastest-growing consumer markets on Earth. The phones are already in the pockets of hundreds of millions of people who will likely never own an iPhone. And the operating system on those phones is getting smarter, deeper, and more integrated into those users' lives with every passing quarter. That is not a trend. That is a foundation. And foundations take a very long time to move. If this video changed how you see the global smartphone market, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Do you think Apple can build the kind of trust in emerging markets that Oppo has spent a decade earning? Or is this advantage structural and permanent? We read every single one.